She had been in the car since 20 minutes to 10 the night before. 5 cars had left the Hall of Justice in Los Angeles. Somewhere out past Westmoreland, the sheriff took the wrong road, and by the time they found the highway again, there were only 3. 2 carloads of newspapermen were simply gone, somewhere in the California desert in the dark. She was tubercular. She did not travel well. They stopped for breakfast at Yuma at 20 past 10 in the morning, and she told a reporter she was deadly tired. Sheriff McFadden had a reputation for fast driving. He had expected to make Phoenix by 10, but the road out of Yuma was full of automobiles, hundreds of them, people who had driven out from towns along the line and parked to watch her go by. And it took him more than an hour to cover the 30 miles to Welton. He stopped and telephoned ahead. He wasn't going to make it before 1. They reached Phoenix at 20 minutes to 3. There were 4,000 or 5,000 people around the city and county building. Deputies had strung ropes along the driveway an hour early. The crowd was in good spirits. The paper called them lighthearted and wisecracking. And when one man shouted, "My God, mister, are you gonna hang her?" there was a burst of laughter, and the crowd gave way. And the big black sedan came down Jefferson Street and turned in toward the criminal division of the sheriff's office. They jeered her. And this part I found very interesting. She got out of that car deathly pale, and she looked at them, not past them. The reporter who was standing there wrote it down. She looked searchingly into many faces. She was looking for someone. There had been men at those parties. Wealthy men, married men, men whose names the county attorney's office had admitted it did not dare connect to any of this. The men the newspapers had started calling the Playboys. She had been seen in one of their cars 4 days before her friends died, sitting outside their house because he had promised her they wouldn't know she was there. She looked into 4,000 or 5,000 faces on the 30th of October, 1931. Not one of them had come. Across town, J.J. Halloran, wealthy Phoenix lumberman, the man that city called Happy Jack, was at his lumber company office. A reporter reached him there and asked what he made of her coming back. He said he had no interest in her return, other than the normal interest of any citizen.
1, 2, 3.
Welcome back to Forgotten True Crime. I'm your host, Trevor Shelby. Before we get into it, I want to take just a second to tell you what this show is. Forgotten True Crime is an independent podcast. And I mean independent. There's no network, no studio, no staff. It's one man. I do the research, I write the episodes, I record them, I edit them, and I get them out into the world, every step of it. So if you enjoy what you hear today, the single best thing you can do is simple: share it. Tell a friend about the show, post an episode on your social media, leave a review wherever you're listening right now. It takes you 30 seconds, and for a show like this one, every little bit helps more than you know. Thank you for that, and thank you for being here. Now, the usual reminder before we begin. Everything you're going to hear comes from the historical record. In this case, that means the newspapers of 1931 and 1932, more than a dozen of them now, court records, state vitals, and more from a dozen different cities, the words of people who were actually there, written down while it was still happening. Here's the thing about newspapers. They get things wrong. Witnesses contradict each other. Reporters chase deadlines, not truth. And 95 years is a long time. So when I tell you what I believe happened, understand that's exactly what it is. My honest read of the record. Where the sources disagree, I'll tell you they disagree. And where we simply don't know, I'll tell you that too. This is part 3. This is the last one, and it might be longer than last episode. We will see. Here's where we left it. Friday night, October 23rd, 1931. After 4 days that half the police in 2 states could not account for, Winnie Ruth Judd walked into a funeral parlor at Court and Olive in Los Angeles and gave herself up to her own attorneys because her husband had asked her to in the newspaper and over the radio. They took her to a receiving hospital, and a doctor took a .25 caliber bullet out of her left hand, and her brother stood beside the table in a white surgical smock and patted her head. And then she talked. For the first time since the trunks came off that train, she talked. And what she said was that Sammy shot her first, that she got the gun away, and that Agnes came at her with an ironing board. Arizona spent the next 24 hours taking that story apart. Now, something I want you to hold on to going into this one. 2 weeks after those trunks were opened, a deputy county attorney named Rogers said something out loud that the state of Arizona has never taken back. He said that if the wound in her hand was real, if a bullet really did go through it that night, then it absolutely would preclude her having disposed of the bodies without the aid of an accomplice. Their words, not mine. Which means the state of Arizona spent the winter of 1932 in a very strange position. They were about to prosecute a woman for a murder they did not believe she committed alone. Her own lawyers were about to argue that she couldn't have done it alone. The sheriff had said on the record that he could put his hands on the man in 15 minutes. And the only person in that entire courtroom who insisted she had no help at all was her. Everything else in this episode happens on top of that. One more thing about the world she came back to. That winter, the governor of the Federal Reserve Bank in Kansas City stood up and told the country that the business barometer had turned upward, and that a depression-weary nation had thrown off the yoke of a distressing situation, which was, and I want to get this exactly right, mostly psychological. On the same page, wheat, which a few weeks earlier had fallen to prices last seen in Elizabethan England, was being hailed as a savior because it had climbed all the way to 63 cents a bushel. That page ran on the 3rd of November, 1931. It's the same page where they printed that Winnie Ruth Judd had been charged with murder. I want to back up 4 days, because the story of how she got into that car is better than the drive was. When part 2 ended, she was in a cell in Los Angeles, and Arizona wanted her. That should have been a fight. Her attorneys had a writ of habeas corpus signed by a superior court judge that could hold her in California until the 3rd of November. Arizona had extradition papers moving north, and the governor of Arizona said he'd sign them the moment they reached his desk. Los Angeles said the hearing would be inside 48 hours. The papers had her out of the state by Wednesday at the latest, and on the 27th of October, her lawyers did an about-face and announced they would fight every single move, that they'd found an error in the Arizona paperwork, and that the moment California's governor signed, they'd drag the whole thing in front of a court, which incidentally they had to go find. Governor Rolfe was in a hospital. His executive secretary approved the papers in Sacramento and then physically carried them to San Francisco so a sick man could sign them at his bedside. So, writ in hand, error found, a fight promised. 2 days later, it was over. On the 29th of October, a lawyer nobody in this story had ever heard of, Paul Schenck, out of Los Angeles, announced that he would not continue the fight against extradition. That night, she was signed out of the Hall of Justice. The formality took a moment. At 9 o'clock, Schenck and her husband came out of the jail hospital, and behind them came Sheriff McFadden and the Maricopa County jail matron. And at 20 minutes to 10, the cars pulled away. One of the last people to put her arms around her at the elevator was another inmate, Daisy DeVoe, who had been Clara Bow's secretary until the newspapers were finished with her. Now, why did the fight just stop? 5 days later in Los Angeles, Paul Schenck told the Associated Press exactly why. And I'm going to read you what he said because the phrasing matters. When it was mutually agreed Mrs. Judd should go to Arizona with these two officers and that extradition matters, habeas corpus proceedings and other legal moves that might have been made should be dismissed, I was given to understand she would not be made the target for lengthy questioning, nor subjected to unnecessary embarrassment. There was a deal. She didn't lose the extradition fight. She sold it. She gave up the writ, gave up the hearing, gave up every card she had in exchange for an understanding about how she'd be treated when she got there. And then Schenck said what he'd found out since. Now I find from reports that they expect to question my client for 50 hours or until they break down her self-defense story, that they expect to have her go to the scene of the murders and reenact the killings and 100 other things. 50 hours, and take her back into that house and have her acted out. He named the two men he said had broken it, the county attorney Lloyd Andrews and the Sheriff McFadden, the same sheriff who'd just driven her across the desert, and he got on a train to Phoenix that night. Andrews called it ridiculous. He denied she'd been harassed and molested. He denied anybody had gone back on anything. He did not deny that promises were made. Neither of them ever did. So that's the car. That's what she was riding in. A woman who had traded away her last legal protection for a promise, being driven overnight through the desert by one of the two men her lawyer said had broken it. And when they got to Phoenix, they put her in the county jail, and for 4 days, nobody saw her. Not a reporter, not a photographer, not the public. From that Friday afternoon until the following Tuesday, she does not appear anywhere in the record. When she finally came out, the papers noted it, her first public appearance since her return. I want to be careful here, because I don't know what happened in those 4 days, and neither does anybody else. Nobody has ever printed an account of them. What I can tell you is that her attorney had publicly warned, before she ever crossed the state line, that Arizona intended to question her for 50 hours, and that there are exactly 4 days there where nobody was watching. One more thing about the afternoon she arrived, and then I'll leave it alone. While the crowd was gathering out on Jefferson Street, waiting to jeer at her, there was a crew of investigators 2 miles away at the house on North 2nd Street. They were working at the cesspool. They were looking for the internal organs of Hedvig Samuelsson, which were missing. They had been missing for 2 weeks. They are still missing now. Before we get to the courtroom, there's something she said back in Los Angeles that I've been carrying around. 4 days before they drove her out, one of the papers explained to its readers what she was going home to. Arizona, it said, plays no favorites. And then, almost as an aside, a woman was hanged there less than a year ago. The next day, in the county jail hospital, some of the other women heard her talking, not to a reporter, to them, and what she said was, "They might hang a woman in Arizona, but I don't think they'd hang a mother, do you?" She had begun hinting that she might be pregnant. The authorities knocked it down within hours. They pointed out that when she was a young girl in Illinois, she'd claimed she was about to become a mother when she wasn't, and that she had a habit of telling people she was a mother when she wasn't. Lloyd Andrews said he'd have her examined the moment she was back in Phoenix, so she knew. She knew Arizona hanged women because one of them had been hanged the winter before. And within a day of finding out she was going back there, she was floating a reason they might not hang her. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, rival newspapers were in a bidding war for her story. On the 3rd of November, they brought her before a justice of the peace named Clarence E. Ice. The two wire services in that room could not agree on what they saw. The United Press said she was deathly pale and appeared near collapse. The Associated Press said she sat there with trembling lips and shaking hands. They agreed on one thing: she could not stand up. Her attorneys asked the judge to let her stay in her chair while the charges were read. He allowed it. Then they read her two of them. The first complaint charged Winnie Ruth Judd with plotting and executing the murder of Agnes Ann Leroy on or about the 16th of October. The second complaint charged Winnie Ruth Judd and John Doe and Richard Rowe with the killing of Hedvig Samuelson. I want to make sure that lands. On the day the state of Arizona formally accused her, it accused her alone of killing Agnes, and it accused her and two unnamed men of killing Sammy. Sammy is the one who was dismembered. Sammy is the one whose body they were dragging a cesspool for. The accomplice wasn't a rumor anymore, or a sheriff talking to reporters. It was written into a charging document with a case number on it. She was ordered, held, without bail. And Andrews, before she ever walked into that room, had already told the press how he intended to use it. There would be two trials, if he needed to. The first would be for the murder of Agnes Leroy, and a second trial for the murder of Hedvig Samuelson would follow in the event a verdict of first-degree murder with the death penalty is not obtained in the first trial. Read that again. Not in case she was acquitted, in case the jury convicted her of something that didn't hang her. The county attorney of Maricopa County had a second capital murder case loaded and waiting, in case the first one failed to kill her. 2 days later, the defense won something. Herman Lukowitz, a Phoenix attorney newly on the case, went to Superior Court and got an order allowing him to go inside the house on North 2nd Street. Andrews filed a petition to have that order dissolved. He argued the court had no jurisdiction because the charges hadn't reached Superior Court yet. Judge Phelps denied him. Andrews gave notice that he'd take it to the Arizona Supreme Court. And I want you to sit with the shape of that for a second because it's a small thing that tells you a lot. 2 days earlier, her lawyer had gone to the newspaper saying Arizona intended to walk his client through the murder house and have her act out the killings. And now the county attorney was in court, fighting to keep her attorney out of that same house. They wanted her in there. They didn't want him in there. He went anyway, walked through the murder bungalow and through her own apartment, while the appeal was still just a notice. And on his way out, he mentioned to a reporter that the defense didn't intend to present anything at all at the preliminary hearings. And then the record goes quiet. When the record picks her up again, it's 4 sentences on page 9 of the Los Angeles Times. 2 state psychiatrists, Dr. Claude Bowers of Los Angeles and Dr. Joseph Catton of San Francisco, today examined Winnie Ruth Judd, who will go on trial the 19th, for the slayings of Mrs. Agnes Leroy and Miss Hedvig Samuelson. 2 things in that. The first is the date, the 19th of January. The second is the word state. Those weren't her doctors. Those were the prosecutions, sent in 12 days before trial to have a look at her mind, which tells you the prosecution already knew what was coming. They fought at the door, not metaphorically. The Associated Press man was standing there and he wrote it down. Spectators fought hand to hand and toe to toe at the courtroom entrance as they struggled to reach seats. Faces were scratched. Clothing was torn. Judge Speakman was supposed to call the case at 9:40. At 9:40, the deputies still couldn't get the witnesses seated. They put the newspapermen out of the room while the bailiffs tried to establish some kind of order. She came in a little before 10, walking between 2 deputies. And here the 2 wires disagree again, and I'm going to give you both, because I think the disagreement is the truer picture. The United Press man saw a woman who had lost considerable weight since her last court appearance, with large hollows under her eyes. The Associated Press man, in the same small room on the same morning, saw a woman who appeared much less frail than she had in October. They agreed on one thing. She was calm. She was wearing a dark blue dress. I'm going to tell you about that dress now, because the story attached to it is one of those things that sounds invented and isn't. The week before her trial opened, another woman had stood trial in that same Phoenix courtroom. A young woman named Billy Baker, charged with manslaughter, and Winnie Ruth Judd, from a cell in the county jail, had lent Billy Baker a dress to wear to court. Billy Baker was acquitted, and so when it came time for her own trial, for her life, Judd wore that same dress. She called it her lucky dress. It was the only one she wore in that courtroom. Her father came in behind her. He'd been in Phoenix a while by then. Back in October, his neighbors in Darlington, Indiana had raised his train fare with a benefit movie and a basketball game, and he'd said he'd travel out when she was called to trial. He came. And while he was waiting, the retired Free Methodist minister had been preaching in Phoenix pulpits, telling congregations that he had no hope of getting his daughter released, only of helping to save her soul. He followed her into the courtroom, leaned across the counsel table, and kissed her. She squeezed his hand and held his eyes for a moment. Then he turned and left the court. Her mother did not enter the room. Her brother Burton stayed until they finished reading the formal charge, and then he walked out too. Her husband stayed all session. He sat beside her and reached over now and then to pat her shoulder. It was established at the outset that the state would ask the supreme penalty: death by hanging. And her attorneys had 3 answers to that in order, and they were going to make all 3. First, that she did not commit the murder. Second, that if she did, she shot in self-defense. And third, that she was insane when it happened. That's not me arranging it for effect. That's how they laid it out to a reporter. She didn't do it. And if she did it, it was self-defense. And if it wasn't, she was mad. The insanity plea was the one they cared about. And they went at it before a single witness was called Lukowitz asking a prospective juror whether, if a reasonable doubt appeared in his mind as to the sanity of this defendant, he would hesitate to vote not guilty. Rogers objected twice. Schenck stood up and said, "All we have to do is raise reasonable doubt. The burden then devolves upon the state to remove such doubt." Judge Speakman sided with the defense. First point of the trial, and the defense took it. Then Lukowitz asked a prospective juror a different question. He asked him whether he was acquainted with J.J. Halloran. That was the first time Halloran's name came officially into the case. 3 months of him being a car outside a house, and a message into a jail cell, and a man at a lumber office with no particular interest. And the first time his name is in that record, it's her own lawyer on day one, asking 12 strangers whether they know him. That's not an accident. That's a map of where they were going. They took the jury out of the men of Maricopa County: a bookkeeper, a clerk, a machinist, a dairyman, a carpenter. One man neither side bothered to ask about. The first two took 55 minutes to seat. Most of them were church members, middle-aged, married men with families, a minister's daughter on trial for killing 2 women over what would be said about her to a married man, in front of 12 married church-going men. The dairyman's name was Henry J. Aden, and when the defense asked him about insanity as a defense, he told them exactly what he thought of it. "It will have to be proven to me. I would not go by any cheap excuse of insanity to pull anybody out of trouble." Judge Speakman asked him whether he'd follow the court's instructions anyway. Aden said he would, and the defense accepted him. 2 more things about that first week, and then we'll go to the evidence. The first is that there was a man sitting in a chair directly behind her. His name was Dr. George Stevens, and he was a psychiatrist, and he was a superintendent of the Arizona State Hospital for the insane. He'd been subpoenaed by the defense, and all through the morning session, he sat at her back and made copious notes on how she behaved in that room. The second is what she did with her hands. When her own lawyers were questioning the jury panel, she let her attention wander. But when Rogers stood up and started asking each man in turn whether he had any prejudice against capital punishment, she started working at her handkerchief, twisting it, and glancing sideways at her husband. They watched her face, too. Reporters were watching for one thing in particular, and on the second day, they got their answer and wrote it down. She did not change the expression of her face when the name of Halloran was injected into the proceedings. And then at the recess, after 2 jurors had been accepted, she curled up in her chair with one foot underneath her and smiled at her husband while the photographer's flashbulbs went off around her. One more question from that first day that I want you to keep. While the defense was examining the very first juror they accepted, a man named Knox, Lukowitz asked him this: "Should the defendant not take the witness stand, would you still have the same thoughts you have now in regard to this case?" Knox said it would make no difference to him at all. Nobody in that room commented on it. It went by in a line of newsprint, but her lawyers had just told a juror on the first morning of a capital trial that they were not planning to let her speak. Here's the thing nobody expects about this trial. The state of Arizona had a confessed killer. It had 2 bodies shipped across a state line in her luggage. It had a woman who had admitted in print under her own name and for money that she shot both of them. And its case fell apart. in its own hands. It started with the doctor. The prosecution called Dr. A.F. Wagner, a veteran autopsy surgeon out of Los Angeles, to describe in detail what had killed Agnes Leroy and Hedvig Samuelson. Ordinary, necessary prosecution testimony. Then the defense got up to cross-examine him and asked him about the dismemberment. And Wagner told them that it would have been almost impossible for Sammy's body to have been taken apart the way it was, except shortly after she was killed. Now, I want to slow down here because you've been carrying this with you for 2 episodes. Since the moment those trunks came open in October, the dismemberment has been the thing nobody could explain. She never explained it. Not in the mortuary, not in 10 handwritten pages torn up in a department store restroom, not in the statements she sold to the newspapers. The coroner didn't explain it. The men dragging that cesspool couldn't find enough of Hedvig Samuelson to explain it. And on that morning in January, her lawyers picked it up and used it as a weapon. Because if it had to be done immediately, and if she was only in that apartment for the short time one of the state's own witnesses had put her there, then she did not have time to shoot 2 women and take one of them apart. Not alone. The papers reported that the defense counted 2 victories out of that cross-examination. The first was the time. The second I'll come back to, because it's the stranger one. Then came the blood. A police detective named McCord Harrison testified that he had found blood stains on the floor and on the baseboard near the head of Agnes Leroy's bed. That's the state's whole theory right there in one sentence, because what the prosecution intended to prove was that Agnes Leroy was shot to death as she slept in her bed, and that Sammy, too, was shot in her bed. Although only after she'd been woken by the sound of the gun that killed her roommate. Sit with that a second. That's the version Arizona was selling to 12 men. Agnes never woke up. Sammy woke up to the sound of Agnes dying and was shot anyway in her bed. Harrison was also asked about the kitchen. He said he saw no stains in the kitchen. Then the defense cross-examined another state witness, Dr. Goss, and Dr. Goss admitted that he had found some blood stains in the kitchen near the sink. Now, why does a spot of blood by a sink matter more than anything else in this trial? Because of what she wrote? In those 10 pages she tore up and left in a department store in Los Angeles before she was caught, before she had a lawyer, before anybody had told her what to say, she described how it started, and she did not describe 2 women asleep in their beds. She wrote, "The next morning, all 3 of us were yet in our pajamas when the quarrel began, and we were in the kitchen just starting breakfast. One state witness said there was no blood in that kitchen. Another state witness, made to answer under cross-examination, said there was. I'm not going to tell you which of them was right because I don't know, and neither do you, and neither did that jury. What I can tell you is that in the entire record of this case, in 115 newspaper articles across 4 months and a dozen cities, that is the only piece of physical evidence that points toward her version of events instead of theirs. And it came out of the prosecution's own witness. By this point, a pattern had set in, and the wire reporters had noticed it. The state called Wagner, and Wagner gave the defense the dismemberment. The state called Goss, and Goss gave the defense the kitchen. And then the state called a nurse named Nora Smith to prove something that should have been devastating. Smith testified about telephone calls. The day after the two women died, she said Winnie Ruth Judd rang her office and asked to have it open, and then rang back an hour later, and this time said she was Agnes Leroy, and that Mrs. Leroy would not be at work that day. That's the state's case for consciousness of guilt. That's a woman covering up. And her lead attorney, Paul Schenck, announced that he was going to call Nora Smith back as a witness for the defense because his argument was this: anyone who would telephone the same person twice within an hour and seriously pretend to be two different people, one of them a woman she had just killed, was not sane. They didn't fight that testimony. They took it. The call that was supposed to hang her became the call that was supposed to save her. On the 25th of January, a United Press correspondent sat down and wrote a sentence about the state's case that I still find remarkable given who he was writing about. The state so far has failed to prove motive, has not placed Mrs. Judd at the scene of the crime at the time it was committed, and its witnesses have continually been turned to favor the defense of insanity, no motive, not placed at the scene at the time, and its own witnesses working for the other side. The state had promised a motive in its opening statement. It had been hinted that jealousy over a man was behind it. But as of that morning, the paper wrote, there was nothing to substantiate that. The furthest Arizona had gone was to say a motive would be shown, and that ill feeling had existed between Mrs. Judd and the two victims as long as 5 weeks before the murders. Ill feeling. 5 weeks. And here's what makes that hard to sit with. We know the motive. You know it. It's in her own handwriting, printed in a Los Angeles newspaper 3 months before that trial began. The nurse she introduced to the men at those parties, and Ann and Sammy telling her that if she went hunting, they would tell Jack Halloran what she'd done. She'd written it down. She'd repeated it to the psychiatrists. And the state of Arizona, prosecuting a woman for her life, went 11 days without putting any of it in front of the jury. Which is when Lloyd Andrews stood up and produced two women nobody had been expecting. The first of them was a nurse named Lucille Moore, and what she had was an evening. She'd met Winnie Ruth Judd on the 1st of September, and on the evening of the 15th of October, the night before the state says the women died, Judd and a man came to her home and asked her to come out with them. She had never met the man before. The man was Jack Halloran. They drove to 2929 North 2nd Street, and before they got there, Moore testified. Ruth asked Jack to remember that he had promised not to let Ann and Sammy know she was in the car. He said he would remember. He went into the house alone, and Moore, sitting out there in the dark with her, watched Ann come to the window and look out. Then Ruth turned to her and said, "What do you think of Jack?" Moore said, "I think he's very nice." And Ruth said, and this is on the trial record in a nurse's mouth in front of 12 men, "He's nicer than that. I think he is perfectly grand." Halloran came back out of the house. He wasn't alone. He came out with two other men, a Mr. Ryan and a Mr. Townsend, and Ruth Judd took him to task, right there, for letting the women in that house know she was sitting outside in his car. "Jack, you promised they wouldn't know I was here." He said, "Oh, forget it." The second woman was stranger. Her name was Mrs. A.R. Lepker, and she was the only surprise witness the state produced in the entire trial. She'd met Judd twice once in July when Judd was visiting the sick at a Phoenix hospital, and again in August at the clinic. And this is what she told the court. Until after this trouble, I didn't know she was Mrs. Judd. I knew her as Mrs. Buckley. She'd been using another name. Mrs. Buckley, Lepker said, had talked to her about her boyfriend. His name was Jack. Jack was going to Los Angeles, and then coming back to Phoenix for a day, and then going east for 2 weeks. And she said she was indeed glad he was going. And then Lepker said Judd told her she got so angry with Sammy and Jack sometimes that she thought she would go crazy. Herman Lukowitz cross-examined her for a long time and got nowhere. He finally demanded that she explain how Jack Halloran's name had come up between two women who barely knew each other. "I don't know," she snapped. "That's all. Get off the stand," he said. And then Lloyd Andrews stood up in front of the jury with the letter, the stained fragments of it. The 10 pages she'd torn up and pushed into a lavatory in a department store on Broadway in Los Angeles that the building engineer, a man named Carl Riley, had found and carried to the police. And Andrews read it aloud to 12 men. The reporter in the room wrote that he read it haltingly. It was addressed to her husband. It called him darling. The paper described it as a rambling document. In it, she said she believed they were going to kill her. She described making herself pack the bodies, telling herself over and over that she had to or she'd be hung. And she wrote, "My left hand is about shot off." Now, 6 days earlier, the state had been fighting to get that letter admitted, and the defense had been working to have every one of her so-called confessions disbelieved. And on this morning, when the county attorney stood up to read it to the jury, Herman Lukowitz did not object. He offered to help. He told the court he had a typewritten copy of it in his own files, and he offered to hand it to the jurymen so they could follow along. The offer was accepted. Think about what that means. Her own attorney, at her capital murder trial, made sure that 12 men each got a clean, readable copy of her confession. Because a rambling document isn't a confession anymore. A rambling document is an exhibit. The most damning thing Winnie Ruth Judd ever wrote had changed sides. The state rested at 3 minutes to 11 in the morning, and I have to tell you what it never got to. In all of it, every witness, every exhibit, 11 days, the state of Arizona never addressed the wound in her hand. They established that a .25 caliber shell had been found in her apartment and another in the baggage with the bodies. That's it. The bullet that a doctor had dug out from between her index and middle fingers in a Los Angeles receiving hospital, the wound their own deputy county attorney had said would absolutely preclude her having disposed of the bodies without the aid of an accomplice. The prosecution rested a capital case without putting a word of it to the jury. It came in sideways instead, through other people. The caretaker at the clinic saw her hand bandaged on the morning of the 17th of October. Asked which hand, he said he didn't remember. But a rancher from Wickenburg named Mike Kirks and his daughter Stella had come into that clinic that same morning, and they were certain. It was her left hand. It was bandaged. And Kirkes told the court what she'd said about it. She said her hand was burned up. That's the first explanation Winnie Ruth Judd ever gave anyone for the wound in her left hand. Not a bullet, a burn. Andrews kept more than 30 witnesses in reserve for rebuttal. They rested anyway. The defense moved for a directed verdict of acquittal. Judge Speakman overruled it. And then the defense waived its opening statement entirely. No speech, no preview, nothing. And went straight to its first witness, a neighbor, a man named Henry Behodigee, who lived near the house on North 2nd Street. And what the defense wanted out of him was the clock. Behodigee testified that he heard 2 shots and screams from that house at about 6 o'clock in the morning on the 17th of October. Morning, the 17th. Which is exactly what she had written in the letter that they had spent 11 days trying to discredit, and that they had just handed to the jury in a clean typed copy. On cross-examination, Rogers walked Behodigee backwards. Had he heard disturbances at that house before? He had. Were the sounds that morning similar to what he'd heard before? They were. And hadn't he told an investigator something else about them? He had. He'd told an investigator it might have been a screen door slamming. The defense called her mother. I want you to understand what that took. On the first morning of the trial, when her father came in and kissed her across the counsel table, her mother did not come into the room. She stayed outside. Back in October, when the neighbors in Darlington were raising the train fare, the papers described her as an invalid, an elderly woman, not well, who had come 2,000 miles to a courthouse and could not make herself walk through the door. On the 26th of January, she walked through it and she sat down in the witness chair, and the reporter in the room wrote that she was gray-haired and that she was striving to save her daughter from the gallows. And here is what they asked her. They asked her whether Winnie Ruth Judd had ever had a child. She said no. They asked her whether her daughter had ever adopted a child. She said no. That's it. That's the testimony. You have to know what's underneath it. In those 10 pages, she wrote in hiding, she'd confessed something she said she had never told anyone. That ever since she was 7 years old, she had been telling people she had a baby. At 7, she told her school her mother had had one. At 16, she said she was pregnant when she wasn't, and staged a kidnapping around it, and let a boy be arrested for it. In Phoenix, she told people she had a little boy, and showed them a photograph of her husband holding somebody else's baby, and said it was her son. I don't know what possessed me, she wrote, but every so often I tell that lie. So I'm crazy on that line. And so on a Tuesday in January, in a packed courtroom in Phoenix, Arizona, her mother took an oath and told 12 men that her daughter had never had a child. Not as a mother defending her, as evidence, to help prove that the woman she raised was insane. And while she was sitting in that chair doing that, her daughter walked out of the courtroom. She had a pretext for it. The reporter doesn't say what. She got past the jail matron and out into the corridor, and the corridor was full of sheriff's deputies, and she called back to her brother. Get my lawyers. Sheriff McFadden is telling witnesses what to say. They brought her back in. She came through the door and turned on her heel and went straight back out, her body shaking. The matron went after her. She told her, the paper says peremptorily, I'm going out there again. And she slipped past her. She found McFadden in the hallway, and when he moved off, she went after him, followed him into an anteroom off the judge's private chambers with the matron behind her, and she spatted at him. You're trying to hang me. You've been telling witnesses what to say about me. He didn't answer her. He walked through into the judge's chambers and shut the door and left the matron to quiet her down. The paper described her standing there, white-faced, fiery-eyed. Afterward, jail attendants told reporters that she'd been getting hostile toward the sheriff for several days, and the reporter noted almost in passing that this was the second outbreak since the trial began. I don't have the first one. I've looked. Whatever happened the first time, it isn't in front of me. So I'm telling you that there was one, and that I can't tell you what it was. And then she came back into the courtroom, and she laughed. Not a small laugh. The Associated Press man watched her sit down next to Dr. George Stevens and start talking. Animatedly, he wrote, gesturing with her hands and her shoulders, her eyes sparkling. And she threw her head back and laughed. He wrote that it was the first display of hearty laughter she had shown since the trial began. Now hold the whole thing in your head at once. Her mother is in the witness chair, under oath, telling a jury that her daughter has never had a child, so that a jury might believe her daughter is out of her mind. Her daughter has just chased the sheriff of Maricopa County into a room off the judge's chambers, screaming that he is trying to hang her. And then she comes back and sits down beside the superintendent of the Arizona State Hospital for the insane. The man the defense has subpoenaed, the man who has been sitting behind her for a week making notes on how she behaves. And she throws back her head and laughs. I'm not going to tell you what that was. I don't know whether that was a sick woman or a frightened one or a performance or all three at once. 12 men were about to decide the same question with a great deal less information than we have, and they were going to do it in under 3 hours. The defense finished, and Winnie Ruth Judd never took the stand. I want to mark that because it went by so quietly, you could miss it. On the very first morning, before a single juror had been seated, Herman Lukowitz had asked a man named Knox whether it would change his thinking if the defendant did not testify. Knox said it would make no difference to him at all. Nobody remarked on it. It ran as one line of newsprint on the 19th of January. And that was the plan, and the plan held. The woman at the center of the biggest murder story in America did not speak at her own trial for her life. Everything the jury knew about her, they knew because somebody else had said it. Her mother, her employer's caretaker, a rancher from Wickenburg, a nurse who'd gone for a car ride with her, a woman who knew her as Mrs. Buckley, 2 detectives who disagreed about a kitchen, a county attorney reading her own torn-up letter out loud, haltingly, while her own lawyer handed the jury a clean-typed copy of it to follow along. She sat there and let all of it happen. They gave it to the jury on the 8th of February. The jurors were out for less than 3 hours. Judge Speakman had already gone home. When word came, he drove back to the courthouse to take the verdict, and it was read a little before 9:30 at night. Guilty of murder in the first degree, and the penalty fixed at death. Winnie Ruth Judd was going to hang. Afterward, the foreman talked to reporters. His name was George B. Thompson, and the paper called him a serious young man, and he explained how it had gone in that room. 6 ballots. On the first ballot, all 12 of them voted her guilty. That was never in question, not for one man, not for 1 minute. The second ballot was about the degree, and that came back 10-2 for first-degree murder and the death penalty. 4 more ballots. And on the 6th, it was unanimous. Death. So the 4 extra rounds weren't about whether she'd done it. They were about bringing 2 men around to hanging her. And then Thompson said something else. and it is the single strangest fact in this entire trial. He said that at no time did the question of the defendant's sanity enter the consideration. At no time. The chief defense plea was insanity. Her attorneys had pleaded with those men that she was insane, whether she committed the crime or not, and that she should be sent to an asylum for life. The state had shipped in 2 psychiatrists from California to examine her 12 days before the trial. The superintendent of the Arizona State Hospital had sat behind her for 3 weeks taking notes. Her mother had come off her sickbed and sworn an oath about a child that never existed. And 12 men talked it over for under 3 hours and never brought it up once. She showed nothing. That's what everyone in the room noticed, and it's what the reporter led with. She showed no emotion as the verdict was read, just as she had all the way through when things were breaking the worst possible way for her. She appeared not to realize the significance of the event. Her husband was sitting beside her. He reached over and patted her shoulder, gently, the way he had every day of that trial. She paid no attention to him or to anybody else. She just went on twisting her handkerchief and staring around Judge Speakman's courtroom. Now, that handkerchief, you've been watching her do that since the first morning, fingering it during jury selection, wrapping it around her left hand all through the day the state rested, twisting it while a jury told her she was going to be hanged. Every reporter in that room had been writing it down for 3 weeks as a nervous habit. It wasn't a nervous habit. The United Press man who covered the verdict put it in one clause, almost as an aside, and it rereads the whole trial. She continued to twist her handkerchief nervously, a stereotyped movement which the defense claimed was a symptom of dementia praecox. Dementia praecox, it's the term they used in 1932 for what we would now call schizophrenia. Her lawyers had been showing that gesture to the jury. It was an exhibit. Every time she sat in that chair and worked at that piece of cloth, her defense was pointing at it, and the jury never discussed her sanity at all. Her husband was the only member of her family in the room when they read it. Her father, who had crossed the country on money his neighbors raised at a benefit basketball game, who had been standing up in Phoenix pulpits saying he had no hope of getting his daughter out, only of saving her soul, was not in court. Her mother, who 11 days earlier had sworn that oath for her, was not in court. Burton isn't mentioned at all. Only the husband, the one who had been selling her story to the newspapers since October, who had bought the clothes she wore into that courtroom with the money. He patted her shoulder, and she didn't look at him. A reporter asked Dr. Judd what he thought of the verdict. He wouldn't give an opinion. He made a hopeless sort of gesture at the questions, and he said, "What could I say? There's one more thing from that night." The matron walked her back to her cell and afterward said that Mrs. Judd changed not at all. And Sheriff McFadden, the man she had chased into the judge's anteroom days earlier, screaming that he was trying to hang her, was so unsettled by how little she reacted to being sentenced to death that he went and found Judge Speakman, and the two of them talked it over, and he put a guard on her cell to stop her killing herself. The state of Arizona had just decided to hang Winnie Ruth Judd, and the sheriff of Maricopa County spent that night making sure she stayed alive long enough for them to do it. He told the reporters what she said to him on the way down. "All she said to me was goodbye. and she didn't do it a bit different than she did on other occasions when I took her to her cell. The jury had been unanimous, 6 ballots, and on the 6th, every man in that room voted to hang her. That is what the foreman told the newspapers on the night of the 8th of February. Then 17 days went by, and on the 25th, they brought her back into Judge Speakman's courtroom to be sentenced. The room was full. It was full because a report had been going around Phoenix that Winnie Ruth Judd had decided to tell everything. And I want you to sit with what that phrase meant in that city, in that week. It did not mean she was going to confess. Everybody already believed she'd done it. 12 men had just said so. Tell everything meant one thing and one thing only. It meant a name. The deputy county attorney had said back in October that if the wound in her hand was real, it absolutely would preclude her having disposed of the bodies without the aid of an accomplice. The state had charged John Doe and Richard Rowe alongside her for the murder of Hedvig Samuelson. Her own lawyers had built their entire defense on the argument that she could not have done it alone. Everyone in that room believed there had been somebody else in that house. And now she was under sentence of death, with nothing left to trade and nothing left to lose. And the word in Phoenix was that she was finally going to say who. So the courtroom was packed. There's a formality that comes at the end of a criminal case. The court asks whether there is any legal cause why sentence should not be pronounced upon the defendant. It is not really an invitation to speak. It's a procedural box. The lawyer says no, and the judge reads the sentence. Her attorney, Herman Lukowitz, told the court there was no legal cause why sentence should not be pronounced. And then Winnie Ruth Judd stood up. She had sat in that courtroom for 6 weeks. She had not testified. She had not been cross-examined. The jury had condemned her without ever hearing her voice. Her own lawyer had just declined the last word on her behalf. She took it anyway. I have this to say, she said. And here is what she said. This is the United Press man's transcription, printed in newspapers across the country. Mr. Kleinman, a juror, went into the jury room calling me names, vulgar names, saying, I have a friend on the pardon board. If we sentence her to hang, she'll talk. Judge Speakman's gavel crashed. Now, take that apart, because she said it fast and it went by fast, and it is one of the ugliest sentences in this entire case. She is accusing a man who sat on her jury of 2 things. The first is that he stood in that jury room and called her vulgar names. The second is worse. I have a friend on the pardon board. She is saying that a juror told the other 11 men that the death sentence wouldn't stick. That he personally knew somebody with the power to undo it. That they could put a rope around her neck, and it would not actually be a rope. It would be a lever. If we sentence her to hang, she'll talk. That is not a jury deciding a punishment. By her account, that is a jury deciding on an interrogation technique, on the assurance of one of its own members that the sentence was reversible. The gavel came down. Mrs. Judd, the judge said, I have every sympathy for you, but we cannot have a discussion of these matters. If you have anything to say based on the record, I will hear you. And I want to be fair to Howard Speakman here, because he is not being cruel in that moment. He is telling her the truth about where she is standing. He can only hear what is in the record, and nothing she wanted to say was in the record, because for 6 weeks she had said nothing that could go into it. She began again. Neither of those girls were murdered. They weren't shot in the bedroom. There was no evidence of premeditation. There was no blood in the bedroom. Listen to what she went after. Not the men, not the parties, not Halloran. She stood up at her own sentencing and went straight at the forensics. And she went at the exact place where the state's case had been softest. The state's chemist had found blood stains in the kitchen. The state's physician described the bedroom. Where those women were shot was the one thing that trial never settled, and she knew it, because she had been sitting there listening to every word of it with a handkerchief in her hands. Mrs. Judd, we can't discuss those matters. If there is anything in the record, all right, she cried. The reporter wrote that the spectators leaned forward. I was shot first. Neither girl was murdered. Sit down, Mrs. Judd. And that was all of it. 4 words. I was shot first. That was the entire defense of Winnie Ruth Judd, spoken out loud in a courtroom for the first and only time, 17 days after 12 men had already decided she was going to hang for it. The wireman wrote that her face fell back into the expressionless white mask it had worn all through the trial as she sank into her seat amid the clatter of gavels. And then the sentence was read to her. All of it. The full formula, the old words, the ones they don't shorten. That you be hanged by your neck until you are dead, and may God have mercy on your soul. She stood and listened to that, the reporter wrote, calmly gazing about the courtroom, as though the words did not sentence her. The judge denied the motion for a new trial and was immediately served with notice of appeal. The execution was set for May. But here's the thing about that hearing, and the thing the United Press man put right at the top of his story before any of the quotes. He wrote that the spectators were more startled by what she did not say than by her semi-hysterical words. The whole city had come to hear her name, the man, and she talked about a juror and about blood in a bedroom, and she never came anywhere near him, not once. They took her to the state penitentiary at Florence and put her on condemned row, with a guard on her 24 hours a day so that she could not take her own life before the state of Arizona could take it for her. Her first night in that cell, she said one thing: "Oh, I don't like it here." Her mother and father were in Arizona for all of it. On the 26th of February, 1932, the day after the sentencing, he walked into a condemned cell at the Arizona State Prison, and his daughter burst into tears the moment he came through the door. He prayed with her, one line at a time. He said it, and she said it back after him. She had not prayed publicly since the killings. She wept when they left. The woman who did not change her expression when 12 men told her she was going to hang, cried when her mother and father walked into the room. 2 days later, that story went out over the wire, and the paper that ran it gave it a headline that I'm going to read to you exactly as it was printed, and then I'm going to stop talking for a second. Winnie Ruth Judd is learning to cry. She had not spoken at her own trial, not one word. Her lawyers had told the very first juror they picked that she wouldn't and she didn't, and 12 men sentenced her to death, having never once heard her voice. On the 12th of December, 1932, the Supreme Court of Arizona affirmed the conviction and the sentence. 12 assignments of error, every one of them rejected. A new date was set, the 17th of February, 1933. And that is when Winnie Ruth Judd started talking. At the end of December, she sat down in front of a grand jury and told them what the papers were calling her whole true story. She said she killed both of those women herself, alone, in self-defense. She said nobody helped her do it, but she said that men came into it afterward at the problem of two bodies in a house and the problem of getting her out of Arizona. On the 30th of December, 1932, that grand jury indicted Jack Halloran, not for murder. He was charged as an accessory, a man who knew a killing had happened and hid it. Maximum penalty, 5 years. He posted $3,000 bond and was out the same afternoon. Reporters caught him walking out of that courtroom. He was described as tight-lipped, and he gave them 2 words. It's true. And in January of 1933, at his preliminary hearing, the state's star witness against Jack Halloran was the woman the state had already condemned to death. She took that stand on the 17th, and she did not stop. She put him in that house. She said he came in through the kitchen door ahead of her, that he said, "My God, Sammy," that he felt that girl's pulse and picked her up and laid her on a bed, and that he pulled down the window blind with a bloody left hand. She said he told her a trunk would do it. She said he told her not to tell anybody, not even her husband, and that he'd take care of everything. She said he never came back, and she said a mattress went missing out of that house, the one he'd laid Hedvig Samuelson on. "I wish that mattress would be brought in here," she told that courtroom. "It would have cleared me at my trial. There were no blood stains at the top of it. I would have shown no one was shot in bed. The blood stains were in the center." That was her whole defense, and she was telling a room full of people that the proof of it was a mattress, and that the mattress was gone, and that the man she said took it was sitting 8 feet away from her. He laughed at her from the counsel table. It's in the Wire copy. I'm not going to take you through the rest of it here, and I want to tell you why. It went on for days. She screamed at the judge. She accused Halloran of signaling her answers from across the room. She said out loud in an open courtroom in front of reporters that she was telling the honest-to-God truth, and that she was telling what she intended to write down and take with her to God when she killed herself. That was 31 days before the date Arizona had set to hang her. There is far too much of it to put in this episode, and it is too good to butcher. So I've put all of it up on the website, the full account of what she said on that stand, in her own words, with the sources. Section29.com. Go read it. It's worth your time. Arizona had spent 15 months insisting that Winnie Ruth Judd was a sane, calculating woman who murdered 2 friends and lied about self-defense. It sentenced her to hang on exactly that basis. Its Supreme Court affirmed it in December. And when she finally opened her mouth, the same story that could not save her from the gallows was good enough to walk Jack Halloran out the door. The judge stated, "Corroboration was most unsatisfactory in view of the circumstances. If I should bind the defendant Halloran over to Superior Court, it would be an abuse. Trial in Superior Court would be an idle gesture and an expense to the taxpayers of this county. Therefore, in view of the evidence in connection with the motion, the order of the court is that the complaint is dismissed and the defendant discharged." She was too much of a liar to be believed by the people trying her, and too believable, apparently, to convict the man she named. She was too guilty to be believed, and apparently he was too innocent to charge. 23 days after Jack Halloran walked out of that courthouse, Winnie Ruth Judd was supposed to hang. She didn't. A judge found her insane, and instead of a rope, she was sent to the state hospital. And I want to note something about that quietly, because it's the kind of thing that only shows up if you've been reading these papers in order. The superintendent of the state hospital was Dr. George Stevens. He is the man who sat in a chair directly behind her through her murder trial, subpoenaed by her own defense, making copious notes on how she behaved in that room. He came to look at her in January of 1932. She was delivered to him a little over a year later. She would be there 40 years. And she left that hospital 6 times without permission. One of those times she walked to Yuma along the old Southern Pacific tracks, the same railroad that had carried those 2 trunks to Los Angeles. The last time she was gone for 7 years. She went to the San Francisco Bay Area and became a live-in maid for a family who had no idea who she was. And from 1962 to 1969, she was a woman named Marion Lane. They found her and brought her back to Arizona. A Phoenix attorney named Larry D. Boose got her paroled in 1971. And she kept the name. She was Marion Lane for the rest of her life. Now, I want to tell you about a woman named Rose Mofford, because she is, as far as I can find, the best witnesses anybody has on what became of Winnie Ruth Judd after the newspapers stopped writing about her. In 1940, Rose Mofford was a nurse at the Arizona State Hospital. 48 years later, she was the governor of Arizona. And what she remembered was this, that Judd cooked for the other patients, that she cut their hair, that she looked after a child with hydrocephaly. She had been a nurse when she went in. She went back to nursing. She found her peace, Mofford said. A friend of hers in Sun City, a man named Kenneth Kane, said she never seemed bitter about spending most of her life locked up. She was always thinking of somebody else, never herself. That's the kind of lady she was. And Larry DeBoose, the man who finally got her out, said this: she was bigger than life, but she literally had her life taken away from her. She spent her last decade in Phoenix, in the city that condemned her, still living under the name she took when she ran. And in all that time, she rarely spoke about the case. 67 years, and nobody could agree on why she did it. The prosecutors said jealousy, the newspapers said jealousy, and they were still saying it in her obituary. Her own trial never proved a motive at all. The state rested without one. The Arizona Supreme Court read that letter and concluded she shot Agnes Leroy to stop her from talking. And the letter itself says the whole thing started over a nurse and a hunting trip. 4 authorities, 4 answers. She died on a Friday, the 23rd of October, 1998, in her sleep, at a friend's house in Phoenix. She was 93 years old. The Associated Press put it on the wire that weekend, and the name they gave her in the headline was the same name they gave her when she was a young woman getting off a train under guard: trunk murderess. 67 years, and that was still what she was called. Her body didn't stay in Arizona. Her friends sent her back to California to be buried. She made that trip one more time. And here's the last thing. She surrendered on the night of Friday, the 23rd of October, 1931. She walked into a funeral parlor at Court and Olive in Los Angeles and gave herself up. She died on Friday, the 23rd of October, 1998. 67 years to the day and to the day of the week. Here's my honest read, and it's the same one I've had since about the 4th week of reading these papers. I don't know whether Winnie Ruth Judd killed those 2 women in self-defense. I don't think anybody knows. There is one piece of physical evidence in this entire record that supports her version of that night. And it's a smear of blood by a kitchen sink that one of the state's own witnesses admitted to on cross-examination while another one denied it. But the thing that keeps me up is that almost nobody involved in this case ever believed she was alone in that house. The sheriff said he could put his hands on the man in 15 minutes. The county attorney charged 2 unnamed men alongside her. Her own lawyers built a defense on the argument that she couldn't have done it by herself. And she stood up at her own sentencing and told a judge that a man on her jury had gone into that jury room saying that if they sentenced her to hang, she'd talk. And when she finally said it, when a woman under sentence of death sat on a stand for 3 days and named him, a judge ruled that trying him would be an idle gesture. The only person in this entire story who ever insisted that Winnie Ruth Judd acted alone was Winnie Ruth Judd. And by the time she stopped insisting it, the state had made itself incapable of hearing her. And there is still one thing nobody has ever explained. On the afternoon she came back to Phoenix, while 5,000 people stood on Jefferson Street waiting to jeer at her, there were men 2 miles away dragging a cesspool behind that little stucco duplex on North 2nd Street. They were looking for parts of Hedvig Samuelsson. They did not find them. Nobody ever has. 2 young women went to Arizona to get well. Agnes Leroy had come down from Oregon. Hedvig Samuelsson had taught school in a village in Alaska, and she was so sick she could barely walk when she got here. They rented a bungalow and put a radio in it and made friends. And the worst thing the Phoenix police ever had to say about that house was that the radio played too late. 94 years later, we know the name of the woman who killed them. And we know the name of the man she said helped her. And we know what a jury foreman had for breakfast, practically. We don't know where the rest of Hedvig Samuelsson is. That's the case. If you have any information about this case or a forgotten case you think deserves an episode, reach out at section29.com. If you enjoyed this episode, remember what I said at the top. Share it with a friend, post it, leave a review. It all helps this one-man show more than you know. And make sure you're subscribed, because there's always another one. Until next time, this is Trevor with Forgotten True Crime. Just know you are unique, you are special, and you are loved.